The eyes are the seen and the mind is the seer. And the mind is clearly different from the eyes. The mind is the seen and I, the witness, am the seer. And I, therefore, must be different from the mind. And if we attend to it, it's not a claim. You'll see it is actually a fact.
Yeah.
The mind is as much an object to you as the red rose or your own body and sensory system.
It is my absolute pleasure and honor today to be with Swami Sarvapriyananda. He is the current minister of Vedanta Society of New York. He's a monk, a philosopher, and a popular lecturer. He teaches Advaita, non-dual Vedanta, a system of philosophy designed to help people become self-realized by using methods grounded in reasoning and direct experience. He's considered one of the best-known lecturers of Advaita Vedanta in the world today, with some of his teachings watched by millions of people now on YouTube. Swami has spoken at many conferences, including talks at Google, TEDx, Science and Nonduality Conference, and many renowned universities around the world. He is incredibly well-versed in many other philosophical systems, including the philosophy of mind. His ability to seamlessly relate ancient wisdom to modern cognitive sciences makes his teachings appealing to many scientists around the world, including myself. So it's a great honor to have you here on Talking Brains today, dear Swami.
Thank you, Andres. It's an honor to be here with you.
Should I say that I am happy or that I'm experiencing a happy state of mind? I think we're going to get into those details later.
Right,
yes.
Right.
So just to start simple, what is Advaita Vedanta?
One way of approaching Advaita Vedanta would be textual. So when you say Advaita Vedanta, what texts are you referring to? One of the definitions of Advaita Vedanta is the source of spiritual knowledge called the Upanishads. Now, these Upanishads are maybe 5,000, go all the way back to 5,000 years or so. They form part of the holy books, the scriptures of the Hindus called the Vedas. So these Upanishads are like the culmination of Vedic thought, the final things that the Vedas have to say to us, the ultimate development of Vedic thought. That's why they are known as Vedanta. In Sanskrit, Anta means end. So the final portion of the Vedas, it may not be the final portion of the text itself. It may be these Upanishads are scattered in the Vedas sometimes, and sometimes they are at the end of the Vedic texts. But they are the final, the conclusion of Vedic thought. Yeah, and they are very closely related to consciousness studies. The philosopher and scientist Evan Thompson in the University of British Columbia, he has said that consciousness studies is not a new discipline. It goes all the way back to the Upanishads.
I have his book here, actually.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Awaking,
nice
Dreaming, Being.
Being, yes.
Yeah. He quotes another philosopher there, his father, in fact, who said that the Upanishads are so important in human thought that it might make more sense to date human history as before Upanishads and after Upanishads, instead of AD and BC and CE. Yeah. So the Upanishads they speak a lot about consciousness and about existence and identify the two together. So in that sense, they are perhaps the earliest exploration of what is now consciousness studies.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, Advaita Vedanta has a very well-defined idea, conception of what consciousness is. So in order to have a contrast with that view that I will ask you about in a few minutes, first of all, I would like to define what neuroscientists currently understand by consciousness. And I want to use a definition that Professor Anil Seth gave in this channel a few weeks back. And it's actually in his book, Being You. So he says, for a conscious creature, there is something that is like to be that creature. There is something it is like to be me, something it is like to be you, and probably something it is like to be a sheep or a dolphin. For each of these creatures, subjective experiences are happening. It feels like something to be me, but there is almost certainly nothing it is like to be a bacterium, a blade of grass, or a toy robot. For those things, there is presumably never any subjective experience going on. No inner universe, no awareness, no consciousness. That's the way how he starts his book. So my first question, and I think this is not the easy one, is first of all, Swami, do you agree at any degree with this definition of consciousness? And if not, what would be your definition of it according to Vedanta?
Yes. Before I dive into this, and as you said, it's diving into the deep end, actually.
I agree.
But before I dive into it, I'd just like to flag something here. I should have said it earlier. Upanishads are Vedanta. That's true. I mean, it's generally accepted across Indian philosophy. But Advaita Vedanta is not the only Vedanta. So the various schools of philosophy developed based on the Upanishads, one of which is Advaita Vedanta, the one which I study and teach. But there are endless other schools. There's Vishishta Advaita, Advaita, and different kinds of schools. But Advaita Vedanta should be of special interest to us because if religious people are fanatics of some sort, then Advaitins are consciousness fanatics. So they're specialists in consciousness. But all of these schools are schools of Vedanta, and they all have their own theories of consciousness. But consciousness may not be so central to them as it is to Advaita Vedanta. Okay, having cleared that, I put that out of the way.
That, by the way, it's exactly why I'm very interested in Vedanta, because my subject of study is actually, well, the subject of study that I think I'm studying is consciousness. Yeah.
Right. What Dr. Anil said, I think I would agree to a great deal with what he said. I think it's a very good beginning. And I will go into it later, why I think that's a very good beginning and why I think that's not enough. We have to go a little further down the road. So when he says that it is like something to be a conscious creature, like a human being, some of the, at least the higher animals, and maybe, and we would say all sentient beings, it's something like to be that creature. It's something like to have conscious experiences, like talking and hearing and tasting a cup of coffee. Now, what Vedanta would say here is there are two components to this. Notice when you say it is something like to have a conscious experience, there is a series of conscious experiences, and there is continuous variation across the spectrum. So it is something like to have a cup of coffee, but to see a red rose, it's also something like to see a red rose, see the color red, but that they are two different things, two different experiences. The taste of a cup of coffee and the color of the rose are two different experiences. And yet there is something common to both of them. Now, the definition given by Professor Anil Seth, it sort of obscures this difference. But in both cases, it's something like to be tasting cup of coffee, it's something like to see the color red, so that's consciousness. What Vedanta would say, it's consciousness plus mind. So the way, if you break down the Vedantic epistemology, it would be, there is the coffee, which is out there, presumably, and then you have, you take the coffee and the sense organs kick into action, the tongue, and then it sends impulses up to the brain. And there somehow, we don't know at all how, that information is now presented to us as the taste of coffee. That, according to Vedanta, is the mind. And when you see the color red in a red rose, there is the rose presumably out there, and then the eyes swing into action, and then there is impulses sent to the brain, and then in the mind, red rose is presented. In both cases, the role of consciousness is to illumine the content of the mind. So the content of the mind, in Sanskrit, it's a vritti. Vritti literally means a movement, a modification. Compare the mind to a lake, and the taste of coffee to like a pebble thrown into the lake, and it sets off ripples. The sight of a red rose is like another pebble thrown into the lake and sets off ripples. Those ripples in the surface of the mind are revealed by consciousness. Mm-hmm. What does the mind do? It gives us all these various experiences. What does consciousness do? It enables us to have that first-person experience, that the pure subjectivity, the pure first-personness. Mm-hmm. So I'm making a distinction which explains the variety in conscious experiences and accounts for the objective part of it, the coffee, the neuroscience of it, and the subjective, pure subjective part of it, which is the first personness, let us say. And what Vedanta would say, notice the first person, the fact that it is something inwardly, that it's direct illumination, that is common to all conscious experiences. And what is, when we say all conscious experiences, there is something that keeps changing from experience to experience, which is the objective side of it. Now, when you say this distinction was drawn by the philosopher, Professor Arindam Chakravarti, who teaches at the University of Hawaii. He says, when you say it is something like to feel, something like is already has an objective taste to it. So there is the objective side, which is the world, our senses, and the mind. And there is the pure subject, which is consciousness, according to Advaita Vedanta.
I see. So if I understand correctly, you are making a distinction between consciousness and experience. Apparently, experience here is that consciousness, that witness, plus an object.
Yes. In fact, that's the exact definition which I'm driving towards. Experience is equal to consciousness plus object. Objects keep changing. And the objective side of it has a very complex, if you break it down, analyze it, you will have the world outside if you have a realist epistemology. And then you have the body, the senses, and the mind, and the brain, and the mind, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add something here.
Please.
Definition of consciousness. When you talk about the definition of consciousness, you will find neuroscientists and philosophers of mind also very not very direct about the definition of consciousness, because they can't agree, and for good reason they can't agree. But this is a problem. A friend of mine, a mathematician monk, he dismissed consciousness studies. He said that it's not a mature field. You cannot define what you are studying. It's all over the place. Mm-hmm. And that's a little unkind, but it's a very important field. So you have to keep studying. I think I was listening to Dr. Anil Seth, who said that you don't have to start off doing science with a precise definition. You keep trying to define and redefine and modify the definition as we go along. And actually, there's something analogous to that in Indian philosophy, where definitions, there are several versions of a definition. A definition is set forth, and then the opponents, opponents attack that definition. Then the definition is modified until you come to a satisfactory definition. Yeah. So what would Advaita Vedanta define consciousness as? It's very interesting. Consciousness plus object is experience, and consciousness can be defined as the not this. Mm-hmm. So in every experience, whatever experience we have, all our experiences, which are all first person, these experiences, if you abstract out the objective side, that this, whatever you can call this, is not consciousness. In our experience, whatever you can label as this taste of coffee, this red flower, is not consciousness. This thought, that's also not consciousness. To which that is presented, resulting in a first-person experience, that is consciousness.
So it's basically through a process of elimination that you end up defining what is this consciousness, right?
Right.
Can I, for simplicity of language, can I call that consciousness the pure awareness or the pure consciousness, the witness itself, or is it correct to label it like that?
Absolutely. In fact, those are the terms which are used. In classical Advaita texts in Sanskrit, it's called the Sakshi, or the witness.
The witness.
Just keep it in mind that we are not talking about an act of witnessing. There's some mechanism going on there. It's just its very nature is illumination or luminosity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So is this pure awareness what Vedanta referred to as Brahman and Atman in the texts? And if that's the case, what is where does the non-dual aspect of Vedanta come into play? So the Advaita part.
Right. That's a vast question. All right. So let's get into it. Yes, that pure awareness is what Advaita Vedanta calls Atman or Brahman. Atman means the self. Brahman means the one reality from which this entire diversity has emanated, in which it exists, into which it again folds back again. Now, that's a huge, huge claim. Just by the way, when we talk about pure consciousness, it just means consciousness. It does not mean pure in a good sense and like a nice moral sense. It has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
It's just luminosity itself, without content, abstracted from the content.
Content, perfect.
And the reason why we can indicate it only indirectly is language cannot grasp that. Language is not meant to talk about that. So language requires an object to talk about. So one of the ways we can work around this is to be indirect. Let's say the not this, the neti method, and to point it back, and hopefully the person who's doing this grasps what is said. All right. How is this Atman, Brahman, and how is this non-dual? It is our real self, real in the sense that we are, according to Advaita, not just Advaita, in fact, many of the Indian philosophies, Advaita definitely, Sankhya philosophy definitely, some schools of Buddhism. The idea is that we are beings of pure awareness, just awareness itself, and we have become entangled with the mind and the senses and the body. And so when we talk about ourselves, the self, we say that I am this body-mind. And we may have a vague sense of being aware or conscious. And if it's pointed out to us, we will say that, yes, I am conscious. But we don't literally think of ourselves as beings of pure light, in the sense of pure consciousness, quite apart from body and mind. So that's the first thing that Advaita Vedanta wants to impress upon us, to disentangle in our understanding awareness, pure consciousness, the Atman, from the body-mind identification. Not that you physically extract something from something else. In our understanding, you see the distinction. It's just like I am not the sweater that I'm wearing or the shirt that I'm wearing.
Yes.
The sweater is right here, the shirt is right here, but I am not it.
Yeah.
I'm not even the glasses I see the world
Exactly.
through.
A friend of mine has a very nice way of putting it. He's always saying distinguishing without separating, which I really like.
It's a nice way of putting it. I'll use it.
Yeah, great.
Now, in this process, which is just the first step of Advaita Vedanta, you end up with the understanding that I am this constant, unchanging awareness. Whatever is an object that is subject to change, that keeps changing and gives me experiences, but I am the awareness which is where all the experiences take place. So that is my real nature. That is the self. And there are certain consequences of that. We can explore that later. Why would at all Sankhya, Vedanta be interested in all of this? There's a very important reason why they are interested. So the first step is to see yourself as awareness. And I'm trying to answer the question, where does the non-duality come in? Now, if you just stay with that, I am awareness. And there are huge consequences to this. Then you begin to see that I am not the body, which is the source of so many problems. I'm not even the mind, which I totally identify with. So in that sense, I am an impersonal reality, not even a person. So there are huge moral and personal consequences of that. If you stop with that, that's a dualistic system. You have ended up with awareness and everything else.
Yes.
You've ended up with
And we don't like dualism. At least from a scientific point of view.
Right.
If there is something in neuroscience that we're trying to avoid at every cost, is dualism.
Yeah. Right. So that's where Descartes ended up with the mind-body dualism.
Yeah.
And it is a very respectable pedigree. I mean, if you go back in Indian thought, Sankhya, which is one of the oldest systems. In fact, by some accounting, it is the oldest system. Even the Buddha, 2,500 years back, when he recounts what he learned from his Hindu teachers, most of the teachings, they seem like some proto-Sankhya. So it's a strongly dualistic system. I mean, I was just seeing David Chalmers has recently published this book, Reality Plus. So he refers to the Sankhya and the Advaita system. And the Sankhya system, he says, is thoroughly dualistic. So there is awareness, and there are the objects which appear to awareness. And all the objects belong to nature, to material nature. And if modern science steps in there and says, this is our domain, this is the domain of fundamental physics and all the science is built on it, Sankhya would have no objection at all. All Sankhya wants to say is that consciousness is a fundamental reality. It's not born out of matter. It cannot be reduced to matter. So that's Sankhya. But it's dualism. It's not non-dualism.
And it's ontological one, right? It's essence. So there are two essences and they don't talk to each other.
They talk to each other. And then Sankhya runs into the same problem that Descartes ran into. how does the mind and the body interact?
Exactly. Yeah.
So he had the pineal gland, and he went
Yes.
into all sorts of contortions about it. But Sankhya develops very sophisticated systems of trying to get around this. Consciousness is somehow reflected in matter. Even then, it's a little dicey, but still, there are sophisticated models of how consciousness could interact with entirely different reality called matter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what Advaita Vedanta asks is precisely that question. What is the relationship between consciousness and matter? In fact, before that, another dualism has to be resolved. Sankhya insists there are many consciousnesses. So each sentient being is a separate consciousness.
We're going to get there later. No worries.
So Advaita Vedanta says no, because why would you say that? You can distinguish between bodies, obviously. You can even distinguish between minds. But how would you distinguish between consciousnesses abstracted from body-mind?
Yeah.
So there is no way of distinguishing one consciousness from another. Advaita Vedanta says it is one consciousness. In the Gita, when Krishna is teaching Arjuna, Gita is one of the fundamental texts of Vedanta. He says in one place in the 13th chapter, these bodies are fields, and in each field there is a knower of the field. Those are the terms he uses: field and field knower. And then he goes on to say there is only one field knower. Actually, the field knower is one in all bodies, in all the fields. So consciousness is one, according to Advaita Vedanta. The next step it takes is, to this one consciousness appears the entire material universe. What is the relationship between the material universe and this one consciousness? According to Advaita Vedanta, the material universe appears to consciousness, in consciousness, and is nothing but consciousness. Consciousness is an extraordinary ability to appear as its own object. How this reduction is done, I can talk about it in some little more detail.
Yeah, I have some questions about it later on. So.
Right, so we will get into that.
We're gonna get there.
Right, but just to give you a taste.
Yes, please.
We have this very elderly senior gentleman here, Bill Conrad. He's a retired biophysicist, and he says, no, Swami, the world is not in consciousness, it's outside your consciousness. Let me propose an experiment. Let's put a camera in this room, and we will all leave this room. And then you come back and you see the picture in the camera. It shows the room existing without any of us, apparently we are conscious beings, are not there. We have all left, and the room was still existing. I said to him, Bill, but isn't it true that in your consciousness, you proposed this experiment to Swami? In your consciousness, you set up this experiment. In your awareness, in your consciousness, we left this room. In your consciousness, we come back into this room. In your consciousness, we examine the camera and the pictures in the camera. In your consciousness, it seems to be an empty room. But all throughout, this was happening in awareness, in your consciousness. So this gives us a clue to what Advaita is actually claiming, that the objects which appear to consciousness are not a separate ontological reality, not a second. They appear to be a second reality, but they do not ontologically constitute a second reality. They are not a countably second reality apart from consciousness, no more than the variety of people and events and objects which you see in your dream would be a countable, ontologically different entity apart from the dreaming mind.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in that sense.
Okay, we're gonna come back to that point later on. For those people that are watching this interview that are interested in general in consciousness, it might sound a bit abstract in the sense that we're discussing about kind of things that are out there that we call pure awareness, that we call Brahman, that we call Atman. But we're gonna get into that a bit later. But what I want to ask you, Swami, is, can you give us an example, like a direct experience that we can all do at home that points towards that kind of awareness? I'm pretty sure that you cannot put the finger on because it's not a thing. We're gonna come back to that. But is there any method that you can prescribe to anyone to point towards that awareness?
Right. In fact, I just want to point out that it's actually not abstract. In fact, compared to what we are talking about, everything else is abstract. Even the grossest thing you can think about, like we talked about, yes, the cup of coffee which you are having. That also, in fact, from the perspective we are taking, that's also an abstraction presented to consciousness. To think that there is a world out there and a cup of coffee, which I am tasting, already we have taken a few steps, into moving beyond consciousness.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, we are all the time, Advaita is talking about the vivid experience of life which we are having. It's always rooted in experience. Advaita, properly understood, is not a speculative metaphysics. It claims to be an accurate description of what's going on right now, right here. An example would be, so there are procedures which help us to understand what is it that we are talking about. One is, the most direct one I know is from the Drigdrishya Viveka, which is a medieval text written about 600-700 years ago, where you start with experience. So start with the experience of, let's say, seeing a red rose. And then you just notice that the rose is appearing. It's not just a red rose. If you're going to give an accurate description, it's a rose which you are seeing. Isn't that a more accurate description of what's happening? Yes. So the eyes, let's say in a very naive way, the eyes are seeing the rose. The rose is the seen, the eyes are the seer. Now, blink your eyes. Notice that you're aware of your own eyes. So in that sense, the eyes now become the seen within quotes. You're aware of the eyes. The eyes are open, the eyes are closed. Now the mind is the one which is aware of the eyes. So the mind is the seer and the eyes are now the seen. The seen, of course, in a metaphorical sense.
Exactly.
Now go further back. The thoughts, the contents of the mind, our own thoughts, our emotions. When there is happiness, I am aware that I'm happy. When there is pain or misery, I am aware of the pain and the misery. So these are the contents of the mind, emotions, ideas, memories, even the sense of ego, the personal, these are all, if I'm aware of it, it's a part of the mind. It's a content of the mind. But the fact is that I am aware of it. If I am not aware that I am happy, who else is aware? I'm most directly aware that I'm happy.
Yeah.
So these are changing states, internal states, subjective states, and I'm aware of them. Then whatever I am that is aware of the states of the mind, that is the seer, and the mind becomes the seen. So now notice how far we have come. From something objective like the red rose out there to the senses. The senses are the seer and the rose is the seen. Notice the seer and the seen are different. They're clearly two different entities. Then we come to the senses themselves. They are experienced by the mind. So the mind is the seer and the senses are the seen. In that sense, the mind seems to be something quite different from the sensory system. Now the contents of the mind are experienced. The mind is the seen and I am the seer. Why would I say I? Notice that the sense of self is always on the side of the seer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this final seer, the seer of the mind, that I would identify myself very clearly. I am the seer and the mind is the seer. And this is very dramatic because normally we identify ourselves with the mind automatically. But the mind is a series of, it's like almost like self-talk. Just think a thought like 2 + 2 is 4. And then clearly the 2 + 2, 4 is like mental talk and I'm aware of it. It's not aware of me. So I am aware of the contents of the mind. That within me, which is aware of the contents of the mind, must be my essential self, must be the ultimate seer. You can't go any further back than that because that's no longer an object.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the verse I'm referring to, it's the first verse of that little text. Drigdrishya Viveka literally means the discernment of seer and seen. So it starts with the forms are seen, the eyes are the seer, and the eyes are clearly different from the forms. The eyes are the seen and the mind is the seer, and the mind is clearly different from the eyes. The mind is the seen and I, the witness, am the seer. And I, therefore, must be different from the mind. And if we attend to it, it's not a claim. You'll see it is actually a fact.
Yeah.
The mind is as much an object to you as the red rose or your own body and sensory system. Then the final part of the verse says, that ultimate seer can never be seen, which means it can never be objectified. Now, if we attend to this as an exercise, and just literally sit calmly and look at an object, then from that object become aware of the eyes. Blink your eyes if it helps you to become aware of the eyes. And then The fact that I'm aware of the eyes, that's internal, in the mind, become aware of the mind. And then consider, in the mind itself, what is it that could be aware of the mind? You'll see that you cannot objectify it, but you cannot deny it either. I mean, even it is not the right word for it. It will be I. Mm-hmm. An example will help here. It's like the proof of anything in this room is that I see it. The computer is here. What's the proof? I see it. Andres is here. What is the proof? I see him. Now, if you ask, what is the proof that you have eyes? I can't say that I see my eyes. I mean, even in the computer, I can only see a picture of my eyes. The eyes cannot directly see themselves. If the criterion of proof is seeing something, then I must say that I have no proof of the eyes. But that's ridiculous. The proof that I have eyes is the fact that I see. And if you ask, see what? This is crucial. See what? See anything. The fact that I see anything is a proof that I have eyes. The proof of any one particular thing is I must see that thing, that it exists. But the proof of the seer is that the seeing itself is that there must be the seer. Now, this is a way of pointing out that this is the proof of that ultimate seer, which is the witness, which is awareness itself. That pure awareness must exist because of experience, because of the experience of a variety of objects, external or physical or mental.
That's great, Swami. Thank you for the example. And that brings us, I think, immediately to the next point, which is, you mentioned it in the very beginning, which is the distinction between the mind and the seer and the awareness.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to imagine what my colleagues might say after hearing your explanation. And one of the things that they might say is that, okay, well, we cannot even solve the mind-body problem yet. And what Swami is talking is that we need to include another entity, which is consciousness. So now we're going to have a problem of mind-body and consciousness. So it might complicate things even more. But what I want to argue, and I want your help on this, is that what Vedanta can provide here is a very nice way of re-evaluating the problem by adding a distinction that can be very helpful, which is this distinction between the mind and the awareness.
I agree entirely. See, there's the mind-body dualism, and we are struggling to see how the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain more precisely, can be related at all. And we are getting nowhere, basically. And now Vedanta comes and says the real distinction is between consciousness and its objects, and even the mind is an object. But I think this distinction is very valuable, and it can actually solve a lot of problems, a lot of confusion. For example, the way modern philosophy of mind and neuroscience looks at consciousness, one of the ways is, I think it was Ned Block who proposed in a paper in 1995 that phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness.
Yes.
So phenomenal consciousness is the experience, direct first-person experience of anything, and access consciousness is that which is available to us for rational thought and creativity and all of that. That, if you now look at it from the Vedantic paradigm, is a very mind-centered way of looking at it. What Vedanta would say is that both phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness definitely are consciousness plus two different ways of using the mind. One is a passive way of using the mind where you continuously keep on having experiences. Another is the mind is now deliberately, you're using attention to draw upon the resources of the mind. Consciousness is indistinguishably present everywhere. What I would say is that the Vedantic paradigm or the Sankhyan paradigm, which makes consciousness as the witness of all objects, whether physical or mental, and it constitutes an ontological reality in itself. You might say, first of all, what problem does it solve? What question does it answer? One, it solves the hard problem of consciousness in this way, that it tells us, why is it that we have subjective experiences? It's because of this unique, different ontological reality called consciousness, whose contribution it is to give us first-person experiences. Objects coming in contact with this consciousness generate our first-person experiences. And for that, yes, we need brains and we need this other entity called the mind. We're using a general term mind, but Vedanta and Sankhya have very solid, wonderful models of this, what exactly it is, what it constitutes of, and what does it do. But it solves the problem. It answers the question that why do we have first-person experiences? Because of this reality. Couldn't we answer this without adding one more reality to our already complicated model of the universe? No, we can't. We will have to, in that case, show how we can reduce consciousness to the brain, and that constitutes the whole problem of the mind-body problem, or David Chalmers' new formulation of it, the hard problem of consciousness. In fact, as the philosopher Gallen-Strawson has pointed out, a sort of half humorous piece in the New York Times, the hard problem of matter. Because we have, because of our materialist paradigm, we have made up our minds, everything has to be reduced to matter, and that constitutes explanation. So therefore, consciousness, mind, whatever it is, let's not distinguish between consciousness and mind. It is some kind of first-person experience, and that has to be explained in terms of matter. And then we are finding it very difficult. And Gallen-Strawson says that it's actually consciousness, mind, consciousness, these are directly experienced. And matter is something that is experienced in this mind-consciousness continuum. Therefore, it is matter which must be explained. And then he goes on to say that the more we investigate matter, the more it is literally disappearing before our eyes. It's becoming very difficult to understand what matter is. And consciousness is directly obvious to us.
Yeah.
Vedanta goes in there and says that, notice that matter appears to consciousness. And so we must explain what matter is. Sankhya, the dualistic system, says that matter is a reality. Nature is a reality, independent, ontologically independent of consciousness, and consciousness and nature interact. They call it Purusha and Prakriti, and they interact, and that explains our experience of the universe. Advaita says that won't do. How do they interact? And then it asks the question, where is the boundary of consciousness? Isn't it true, we take a first pass at the problem, you'll say that the universe appears to you, the object appears to you. But to you, if you attend very closely to our first-person experience, is it that something is appearing to me? It has a connotation of being outside me and then appearing to me. This whole question of idealism and realism comes in there. And it's a Buddhist Lama who raised these two questions. If you start off with the paradigm that matter is outside consciousness and consciousness somehow experiences matter, then you're left with two big problems. One is the old problem of idealism. How do you account for matter? How do you prove that matter exists independent of consciousness when all proof has to be done in consciousness, in mind? And the second problem will be, then you have to show how mind is or consciousness is generated from matter. So you are left with the hard problem of consciousness and the problem of idealism, neither of which, somebody called it the standing scandal of philosophy. It can't be resolved all that easily. Yeah. The Advaita approach has this advantage. If you accept consciousness, and people are now beginning to think about it, panpsychism, Bernardo Kastrup and David Chalmers and others.
We're going to get there.
Yeah. If you accept consciousness is a fundamental reality, and then work your way from there, what Advaita Vedanta would say, consciousness appears to matter appears to consciousness, in consciousness, and as nothing other than consciousness, with an extraordinary capacity of appearing to itself as its own object. The advantage is, in that case, all the laws of physics, all our fundamental discoveries of science, none of it is violated. All of it operates in the realm of the object. Let me add something interesting and see how this works. We have a Massimo here in the City University of New York. He's a biologist and a philosopher. And so we have this philosophy cafes and in New York City. So in one time he was giving the classic example of the promissory materialism, saying that we did not understand life. At one time it was said that life is a problem to be understood. We can't understand life. But now, 100 years after that, we do understand the processes which we together call life down to a molecular level. And therefore, give us time, we will understand consciousness. He says, I'm convinced consciousness is something that happens in a living brain, and it's all just the living brain, and that's it. And we cannot explain it yet, but we will be able to explain it. Thomas Nagle, in his landmark paper, What Is It Like to Have a Bath? Later, and somewhere in there, he says that he's not denying materialism at all. He's saying that, yes, consciousness could be material, but it's just like, he gives a nice example. He says in the Greek, in ancient Greece, if a philosopher did suddenly say matter and energy are the same thing, now the statement would be true. Matter is energy. But that philosopher would have no way of understanding. He did not have Einstein at that time. He would have no way of making sense of that statement.
Yeah.
Similarly, Thomas Nagel says it could very well be true that consciousness is nothing but the brain, but we have absolutely no way of understanding how that could be true. Whereas in the Advaitic system, all of our scientific understanding would still continue to be valid there at the level of the object. But we would just explain first-person experience further. Now, what I said to Massimo was that this example of life does not work in principle.
Why?
Why not? See, this is the thing. If you take the Vedantic understanding of consciousness, it becomes very clear. You are explaining life, a complex objective phenomenon, in terms of other more fundamental objective phenomena. As he said, his own language. Now we understand life in terms of fundamental and down to the molecular level. Life, objective phenomena. Molecular level, objective phenomena. But now you are saying, on that paradigm, we are now going to explain consciousness in terms of the brain. Vedanta would immediately jump in and say, you have made a category mistake, Vedanta and Sankhya, because consciousness is not an objective phenomenon. The brain is an objective phenomenon. We are trying to make this jump from the subject to the object, literally in violation of what that first verse said. The ultimate seer is never the seen. You cannot reduce the pure subject to an object. It's what's called a category mistake in philosophy.
Yeah.
It comes from not being able to see how radical this claim is, that there is an entirely different sort of reality called the pure subject.
I think John Searle, John Searle, another great philosopher, he would argue that the fact that some phenomena is ontologically existent, like consciousness, doesn't prevent us for having a science that is epistemologically capable of studying subjective phenomena. Otherwise, when you go to a psychiatrist, then they would say, you know what, all your problems are in consciousness. I have nothing to do with it. Because so there is a clear one-on-one relationship between our experience and the output of that experience in terms of behavior. So I think he would say, look, the fact that the phenomena that we're studying is ontologically subjective does not prevent us from having an epistemology about it. So some kind of way of assessing it objectively. Please. Yes. What would you say about that?
I would agree totally. The fact is that a lot of people today don't agree. The way I present Advaita or the Buddhist understanding of consciousness, one of the strong objections to that is, then we can't do science with it. This is, in fact, exactly what Christoph Koch said.
Yes.
He last year he was launching a book at Harvard Bookstore online event, and I said, "What do you think of David?" Asked him a question. What do you think of David Chalmers' this hard problem of consciousness? He said, you can't do science that way. And I disagree entirely. I agree with Searle that you can, in fact. This is the thing. I mean, not only is there an epistemology of, say, psychopathology, which a shrink deals with, nowhere more so than here in New York. But even for something which we claim to be entirely non-objective, which is pure awareness, even there is an indirect epistemology possible. And that's what I'm trying to plug here, that there are all these ancient philosophies. I mean, not just Advaita Vedanta, Nyaya, Sankhya, the various schools of Buddhism and Jainism, which have sophisticated epistemologies which relate to the pure subject. And this can be fruitfully brought in dialogue with modern philosophy of mind and even with neuroscience and consciousness studies. I'll give an example of where the problem lies. My experience of studying the philosophy of mind is a couple of years ago. I got the opportunity, and I'm very thankful to Harvard University for that. And I'll use this as a shout out to this wonderful professor we had, Professor Cheryl Chen, who taught us the philosophy of mind at the philosophy department at Harvard. But the impression I came away with, the entire field has sort of stagnated since Descartes. I felt that the first and the last person to say anything significant in the philosophy of mind was from 300 years ago, Descartes with his cogito ergo sum. And the rest of the field till today, you can neatly divide it into two categories. One category is trying to reduce the mind, because Descartes doesn't, he doesn't go to the length of, analyzing mind into consciousness and mind, just mind. So there's this whole field of professors and scientists and thinkers trying to reduce the mind to something else, which somebody called nothing buttery. Mind is nothing but the brain, nothing buttery, or the mind is nothing but language. The where you are, Cambridge and Oxford.
Yeah, Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein. Russell and some others. Even just after that, Austin. So, or even Gilbert Ryle.
Yes.
Yes. So we're reducing it to brain, or to language, or to behavior, or to machine states. These are various attempts that were made. And that's one kind of paper you see in the philosophy of mind. The other kind is another whole group of people, I think more sensible, like Thomas Nagle and others, or Searle himself, who say that, sorry, it doesn't work, guys. Because of these reasons, your reduction, the nothing buttery doesn't work. You're making a big jump here. Now, I feel if you bring Advaita, Sankhya, Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism into conversation with modern philosophy of mind, there may be a way out of this deadlock. And this is exactly what you were saying, that, like Searle said, epistemologies of the subject are possible. And they have been in existence for 2,000 to 3,000 years now. There have been long discussions on this. One more point here, I think what I noticed was Descartes himself did not pursue it much further. He was not particularly interested in the cogito. What struck me as a Vedantist was his most important discovery, and which is known for, is how interesting he didn't pursue it. He says, I think a part of the meditation which has been overlooked, after his discovery of the cogito, he just makes a kind of, ironic observation. He says, how strange it is that which I'm absolutely sure of, I don't know anything about it. And that which I'm not at all sure of, I know so much about it. What he's saying here is this cogito, that I exist because of my thoughts. It shows that I exist, that fundamental existence, all I know is that I'm certain of it, but I don't know anything more about it. And all this world which I know about, it can all be doubted, but I know so much about it. And he just says that, and then he leaves it and goes back into the world. Because here is the difference between Descartes' project and the Upanishadic project, or the project in Eastern philosophies. I think this is important to know why this happened. Descartes' project was epistemological. How can he find a ground, a solid ground for knowledge? What can be doubted and what ultimately cannot be doubted? When he discovered what cannot be doubted, the self cannot be doubted, the thinker of thoughts cannot be doubted, and Vedanta would entirely agree with him there. But then he did not go any further with it. He feels that an epistemology is not possible there. I mean, that's the implication of his comment. And his whole project was, he quickly becomes busy after the cogito ergo sum, becomes busy with establishing the existence of God, establishing the existence of the world. And our Professor Chen, she said, notice how the standards of proof have suddenly slipped. Cogito ergo sum is something that we admire even today. But the rest of his arguments for the existence of God and the existence of the world are left for academic philosophers.
Isn't that like the tragedy of the West, that as compared to the knowledge that comes from the East, that we were so busy trying to understand the ontology of the world, that we forgot the subject in some way, and that tend to reappear during, I would say, the first part of 20th century with some German philosophers like Schopenhauer, then with Heidegger, with Husserl, etc., with Freud. There was like this reborn of interest in consciousness and the subject, but most of our intellectual history in the West is kind of completely neglecting the subject. It's mainly about establishing truths that are out there, while from the East we have exactly the opposite, kind of development, right? If I understood correctly, Vedanta is some sort of a monism, and it's an ontological one.
Yes.
Some people would say it's a radical one, but I would say it's just it's an ontological monism. So the main premise is that the only thing that exists is this consciousness, this pure awareness, and the rest of my experience during waking, dreaming, or dreamless sleep are just appearances, right? So can you elaborate a bit on that? Because I think for those that are listening to us at the moment, there is a very nice example of the Turiam, basically the idea that you have three states, and you have this fourth state that is underlying these other three. Would you please elaborate a bit on that system of understanding?
All right. So that's where people have some difficulty, that we are awareness. It's not very difficult to grasp the concept, at least, even if you're not sold on that. It can be pointed out. It seems quite evident to us. Once it's pointed out carefully, doesn't even require a Buddhist Lama or a Hindu Swami. It could just as well be David Chalmers who can point it out to you, that we have, our life is entirely, basically, it's because of awareness we are having what we call life. But everything is awareness, literally. That does not seem to be the case. There seem to be these objects, entire physical world out there, which seems to exist by itself, quite apart from my awareness. Even if I am awareness, still the objects seem to exist by themselves. My dreams, it doesn't do to say that they're like dreams, because my dreams are pretty crude and simple. To think that I could dream up something like this extraordinarily complex universe of the immensely vast and the fantastically tiny, that doesn't seem at all logical. So let me quickly take us on a sweeping tour of Indian thought on this subject, the relation between consciousness and matter. I mean, subject, it's interchangeable, subject and object, awareness and what it is aware of. What is the relationship? Let's just call it crudely, let us say, consciousness and matter. Now, there are multiple approaches to this. One approach would be that consciousness originated from matter, that it can be reduced back to matter. The second approach is that matter originated from consciousness. The third approach is neither originated from the other. They are parallel realities, they're ontologically independent realities which interact. There is the fourth alternative, which is both are appearances, consciousness and matter. And then there's the fifth one, which is the Advaita, that matter appears in consciousness. All right, let me quickly distinguish between these and say whose positions they are. The first one, that consciousness appears from matter, was the ancient Indian materialists called the Charvakas, who in principle are not very different from modern materialist reductionists. We'd say that matter is what exists, body is what exists, and what we call our aware selves are products, byproducts of things happening in the body. It's almost exactly, in principle, the same thing which a modern mainstream scientist would say, a materialist reductionist would say. I think it'll make Daniel Dennett and others very happy to say, that's great.
Absolutely, yeah.
Stop there.
Yeah.
But then you have the hard problem of consciousness. You can't explain that. And then the other one, matter is a product of consciousness. Who says that? Well, actually, if you think about it, all the theistic religions of the world say that, not just the Indian ones. Anybody who imagines that there's a God who created the universe, and the very concept of God is the creator of the universe. That's the same thing in Indian religions and in Middle Eastern religions. And this God is presumably a conscious God, not an inert God, not matter himself or itself. So there is a conscious being who produces matter. So matter is produced by consciousness, actually, really. How? Very big problem, but we have no idea. But anyway, that's one view. The third approach is both are parallel realities. This is the approach of Sankhya, that there is ontologically real consciousness, there is ontologically real universe, and they interact. How? We have to see, but they do. And this is the position of the ancient Sankhya, the ancient Patanjali Yoga, and our modern panpsychist attempts at panpsychism. David Chalmers, in an interview, he said that if you think long enough about the problem of consciousness, then either you become a panpsychist or you go into administration.
I'm about to go to administration.
Administration, I know.
Yeah.
Christoph Koch, he in a debate with David Chalmers, which I attended, he said, when I set out to study the problem of consciousness in neuroscience, all my colleagues told me that's a dead end to your career. You're going to finish your career if you go to consciousness.
Yeah.
That's the third position. Consciousness is a fundamental reality. Not only panpsychists, I think the leading contender for in consciousness studies today, the integrated information
theory, Giulio Tononi. Yeah.
Tononi. That also says something like that. There's kind of a baseline consciousness everywhere, ubiquitous. All right. So those are some parallels that you can group them together. Then the fourth approach would be the Mahayana Buddhist, especially the Madhyamaka Buddhist approach, which is the fundamental philosophy of the Tibetan Buddhists, of the Dalai Lama and others, which says both consciousness and matter are empty in the Buddhist sense. Notice the example an ancient Indian philosopher Chandrakirti gives is bales of hay which lean on each other. So notice how, yes, it's true, as the Advaitin says or Sankhyan says, matter arises in consciousness, you experience it in consciousness. But the fact that we are conscious is also becomes evident only when you have experiences. Mm-hmm. So in an experience, that there is a thing being experienced and an experiencer, both arise, and they seem to depend on each other. Pull out the one, the other doesn't seem to exist. So emptiness of both the experiencer and the experienced. And finally, the Advaitic idea that no, consciousness is not produced from matter. You can't explain how that happens. Matter is also not actually produced from consciousness. Awareness, consciousness cannot become an object. But what it can do, and what it always does par excellence, it is aware. So what it does is it's aware of itself. It is the ability, like a dreaming mind, to produce its own images. So it experiences this universe, mm-hmm. which is an appearance in consciousness. So that's the Advaitic dictum. Consciousness alone is real. The world is an appearance. And you, the sentient being, are none other than consciousness. In Sanskrit, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jiva Brahmeva Napara. When you say the world is an appearance, people say we can't swallow that. That's too much. And aren't you denying all of the world, common sense and science? Not at all. Advaita would be very happy to let science go on in its own way, and your common sense, and even religion, all of it is perfectly fine. Advaita has these two levels of truth, the transactional or empirical level and the absolute level. So transactional level is what we are inhabiting now. You always do that when you're in a virtual reality, when you're experiencing a movie, reading a work of fiction, you are inhabiting two levels of reality, and they're not equal. One is what you would consider the baseline reality. One is a constructed higher order reality, maybe.
Yeah.
You have a reality where science, religion, society, common sense, and even Advaita Vedanta is part of that. And only that Advaita Vedanta points to this fundamental reality underneath the whole thing. All right. So this is one side of it. It's a tour of the various fields of thought. And it also shows us that Indian philosophy or ancient Indian thought is not monolithic. They have not, contrary to the impression I give, they have not solved the problem of consciousness. All I'm trying to say is that there are enormous contributions, and it can be a rich interaction with modern consciousness studies and philosophy of mind. I like the Dalai Lama's attitude. He is entirely open to the possibility that modern neuroscience might actually somehow explain consciousness, not explain away, but actually explain consciousness, in which case we have to follow the truth.
Yeah.
And so all of those ideas which I'm talking about might be relegated to the museum of ideas, something nice to study in the history of philosophy, but no longer taken as truth. It could happen, and one should always be open to that. Why not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. How actually do you reduce the material universe to consciousness only?
Yes, please.
Yeah. All right. Let me just run through it. And if you have questions, objections at every stage, you can flag it.
Yeah. I just want to point out that I think the richness of the tradition that you represent here and now, and the same with Buddhism, is that you have so many distinctions to make about the experience based on systems of knowledge, based on meditation, that we don't have in the West. We, in terms of the distinctions about our own consciousness, we're not even in our teenage years. We're very bad at making real phenomenological distinctions of our own sentience. We're very good with gross categories like attention, executive functions, emotions, perceptions. Which for us, it's good enough for making experiments, but all the very and the nuanced descriptions that we can gather to understand better our problem are coming from the East. And that's invaluable. That's really valuable for our own discipline, to have that system for 3,000 years caring about subjectivity.
Right. I think there can be a very rich cross-fertilization.
Absolutely.
For example, the Dalai Lama himself has set up these study groups where the neuroscience of the brain, you study the effects of meditation.
Yeah.
And so somebody would say, is it a field that ancient India has already finished and completed, and now it doesn't need modern neuroscience? No. In fact, we are in the age of science, and we must see how the two fields map onto each other, and the result can only be good. I mean, you can learn more and more about the brain. See, here is an interesting insight from Sankhya and Advaita. According to Sankhya and Advaita, it might be stunning for modern neuroscientists. They consider the mind to be matter. Literally, the mind is matter. And the mind, if you reduce it to brain in a certain sense, the mind can actually be reduced to the brain. So it is just like the software and the hardware. They are intimately connected.
I agree with that.
Yes. And so the mind, it's not just correlation. It's not just a science of correlations, the neuronal activity and the mind, two ontologically different realities. Not entirely. So the mind is from an Advaitic perspective. Do you experience the brain? If you show me a brain scan, yes. Yep. Do you experience the mind directly? Then both are objects. Do you have any objection to objects interacting? No objection at all.
No.
So the mind and the brain are somehow deeply, intimately connected, and Advaita Vedanta would sign off on that happily. But it would say there's a deeper reality. So when we do the deeper reality of pure consciousness, it's good to flag it right now. It's being conscious. The word consciousness is the closest we can come, but there are a number of words in Sanskrit for this. It's like they say that the Eskimos have many words for snow because they've been studying it for a long time.
Yeah. My point, so exactly.
Right. There is Chaitanya, there is Chit, there is Sambit, there is Chiti, there is Bodha. There are so many words which are pointing to consciousness in itself apart from mind. Here is, before I delve into the subject, how do you reduce ontologically the two into not two?
Yeah.
Here is one more insight, which will be of great help, I think, to the modern philosophy of mind, if not consciousness studies or neuroscience, is the distinction between the knower and the witness. I find a number of papers, which are fundamental papers in the philosophy of mind, which could have benefited from this distinction. So even the Ned Block's great idea of phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. What is the knower and what is the witness? The witness is consciousness itself, which illumines anything which comes as an object. Now that consciousness, channelized through the mind, becomes a knower, which now the thoughts of the mind and the sensory system, they are like instruments deployed by this consciousness channelized. There are multiple theories of how consciousness could interact with the mind. There's a reflection theory, there's a limitation theory, there's an image theory. But in whatever way the consciousness interacts with the mind, now the mind becomes instrument for consciousness, that consciousness which is interacting with the mind. That entity, consciousness, reflected in the mind, using the mind, is what we call knower. That deploys epistemological instruments like the senses, like the capacity to, scientific inference, and it becomes a knower and it gathers knowledge. So the knower and the witness are two distinct entities. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about this question, which will bother a lot of people. Why do you say there is no second reality apart from consciousness? I mean, how is all of this which we are experiencing, how is it consciousness? There are different ways of doing this. I'll do one way, which I like very much. I just heard it from one of the teachers of Advaita Vedanta, modern teacher, who is the Shankaracharya of Puri. So in just a couple of sentences, he ran through this, but we'll have to expand it. From the material world to pure consciousness, right here, without changing anything. You see the whole thing as nothing but consciousness in 7 steps. Let me run through the 7 steps, and it's almost like a tour of Indian philosophy.
Go ahead, that's perfect.
So I'll tell you what they mean, and I'll also give you the technical terms he used for them. Start with the world. Sanskrit word for that is Jagat, this phenomenal world. Then he says, this is nothing but the play of 5 elements, all material, which is the old cosmology, shared by many civilizations of space and air and fire and water and earth. Today we would say matter and energy. Still perfectly material. So matter and energy are the 5 elements. In Sanskrit, Pancha Bhuta Vilasa, the play of 5 elements. Now, next he takes a step. He says, this all matter and energy is nothing but Maya. Maya is supposed to be the power of Brahman, which like the mind can dream and construct a dream world, so that Maya appears as the 5 elements. And here he takes a traditional Advaitin would immediately refer back to the Upanishads. The Upanishads say that from that ultimate reality emerged space and air and fire and water. So the cause exists in the effect, just like clay exists in the pot. Similarly, Maya exists in its effects, which are the 5 elements. So the 5 elements, the play of 5 elements, you can say straight away here that it's a scriptural move, a textual move. They are nothing but the play of Maya. Maya, Vilasa, that's the Sanskrit word. Vilasa means the play or the expansion of Maya. But Maya is supposed to be the power of consciousness in itself. So the power and the one who wields that power, they cannot exist separately. What is the play of Maya is the play of consciousness. In Sanskrit, Chid Vilasa, the play of consciousness. And here we have an entire system of ancient Hindu philosophy called Kashmir Shaivism, who have their own very different idea of what consciousness is. For them, consciousness is not only luminous, but it is also self-aware. And the self-aware nature, it's also reflexively aware of itself, which Advaita Vedanta doesn't say. With consciousness is reflexively aware of itself. It has the capacity to vibrate, and its vibrations are products, are its objects. So it is a whole theory there. It's a very complex. Somebody said it's a Baroque theory, a Baroque cosmology where a very complex universe is produced by the vibrations of this one consciousness called Shiva in their cosmology.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
Can I ask you something there? I think that's a very interesting distinction to me, because I have heard that this pure awareness is aware of itself. I have read that description in several texts, including in some Maharishi Mahesh Yogi texts, and that the variations of this unified kind of awareness creates the entire world. But to me, it's a bit complicated to think about it, because when you make the assertion that awareness can be aware of itself, in some way what you're doing is objectivizing awareness. So it is a bit tricky. I'm not sure if we need to get into that, but all I'm saying is that to me, it makes a lot of noise in my.
It does. And that's exactly what the Advaitins would respond. I mean, right here, what is the debate between the Advaita philosopher and the Kashmiri Shaiva philosopher? The Kashmiri Shaiva philosopher's objection to the Advaita conception of consciousness is, it's no good. It's they say it's just awareness, which is not aware of itself, and there's nothing else for it to be aware of. is as dead as, they say, like a pot, the classic example in Indian philosophy, a clay pot, which is not aware of itself and cannot illuminate anything else also. So what is the difference between a pot or a rock and this so-called amazing luminosity you're talking about? That's the objection. So look at our conception of philosophy, of consciousness, the Kashmiri Shaiva conception of consciousness, which is aware of its own glory, and being aware of its own glory, this very ontological gap between consciousness and its own awareness of itself, is this gap is the space from which the cosmos emerges. So they are very beautiful, and they call it the play of Shiva, and they have a whole theory of vibrations.
I see.
Now, what would the Advaitins say to this? So this is, remember, this is just the fourth step. Why we discard this? When you say you're making a huge, it's a lot of noise here. First of all, when you say you're aware of yourself, consciousness is aware of itself, you're already importing the mind into consciousness. There's an objective element you're importing into. Otherwise, you will have this huge problem of self-reflexivity. So that something operates on itself, like a knife which cuts itself, or that is like a no. It's a strict fallacy. So you can't do that. And the second thing is why we go further ahead from this position. When you say consciousness plays, consciousness vibrates, that's already an objective element. Your change is something that is revealed by consciousness. If it is revealed by consciousness, it cannot be consciousness per se. It must be an appearance to consciousness. Therefore, can we really say consciousness vibrates? Things appear in consciousness, but it's not that consciousness has vibrated and created a thing, something quite apart from it. A good example is our own mind. I mean, just the mind itself, when it dreams, it creates, so to say, creates people and objects and actions, but they are all appearances. When we wake up, that's what we recognize. We say, it didn't happen. Those people were not there. I did not go to that place. I was safe and sound in my bed. None of that happened. None of them were there. They're all appearances. I just say, oh, it was a dream. Now, things can appear to consciousness, but consciousness does not vibrate or change or play. So the fifth level we go to is, no, not a play of consciousness, but appearances in consciousness, which we call chid vivarta. Vivarta means without changing, the cause appears as the effect. So there's an example of a seed which actually changes to become a plant. And there is the example of the rope which by error appears as the snake. Or even without error, the sky which appears to be blue, but without actually being blue, it's colorless.
Sorry, Swami, is it here where the analogy with the example of the mirror or even a computer screen would make sense, in the sense that all the images that can be projected on a screen or it can be seen on a mirror are not the mirror, are just appearances of the mirror. But nobody would say that my face it's the mirror. It's just an appearance, and as my face, anything can actually be projected on a mirror, but the mirror itself is not any of the things that are projected, right?
Right. I'll take you up on that. It's beautiful. This is the exact language that Shankara uses 1400 years ago. He says the universe is like a city seen in a mirror. A beautiful verse, he says, Vishwam darpana drishyamana nagari tulyam. The universe is like a city seen in a mirror. You see from an outside, from a distance, when you see a city, you look at a mirror and you can see the entire city in the mirror, buildings and people and plants and gardens. Now they are appearances in the mirror. And they didn't have computer screens then. I think they would have been delighted with computer screens. You can see everything in a computer screen, whereas there's nothing in the computer screen. It's not that the computer screen became those things somehow, and not like a seed becoming a plant. It's not like the mirror became the face in the mirror. So it's an appearance in the mirror. And if we attend to our own experience, things appear in our awareness. Things appear in the mind. Our awareness does not become people or things or objects. So this is called chid vivarta, appearance in consciousness. Now, in contradistinction to what you just said, the sixth stage would be, hey, wait a minute. When you say appearance in a mirror, yes, there are no people in the mirror, there are no buildings in the mirror, but then that appearance, what is it? What is it that's there? Only the mirror. Those appearances are pervaded by the mirror. So The mirror alone is there where you think it's a building. The mirror alone is there where you think it's a face. The proof is just touch it. You'll touch glass. Similarly, whatever we perceive in consciousness, what we experience in consciousness, all those things must be pervaded through and through by consciousness alone. So this is the sixth stage called Chinmaya, pervaded, consciousness pervasion, pervaded by consciousness. The next step is very simple, last one, is that, hey, wait a minute, pervaded, what kind of pervader and pervaded relationship are you talking about? Is it like I'm sitting in the monastery and you light incense and the fragrance spreads throughout the monastery, the vast hall which is now full of the fragrance of the incense, or there's a dark room, you switch on the light and the light pervades the room? Is it like that? There's a universe which is pervaded by consciousness? No, it is Chinmatra, consciousness only. So there is no pervader and pervaded as such. There is only the consciousness in which the universe is a display. Now, of course, it sounds only weird because we have moved, we are still thinking of consciousness as the way we normally use the word consciousness awareness. This is very far removed from what we were thinking of consciousness. But our ordinary idea of consciousness is consciousness plus mind. Let me quickly run through the 7 steps like magic. We start with the physical world here. Yeah. And the 7 steps very quickly in a sentence. Jagat, material world. Step 1. Step 2, the 5 elements. Pancha Bhuta Vilasa, play of 5 elements. Ancient cosmology, substitute science, fine. 3rd step, Maya, the paradoxical power of Brahman from which all this matter and energy emerge. Maya Vilasa, play of Maya. 4th stage, Chid Vilasa, the play of consciousness. Because after all, Maya is the power of consciousness. So it must be the play of consciousness. 5th stage, it is Chid Vivarta, not play of consciousness. Consciousness doesn't play, vibrate, change, or aware of itself. It's an appearance in consciousness. And then finally, the 6th stage, but appearances are pervaded by consciousness. Chinmayam, pervaded by consciousness. And then finally, what do you mean pervaded? We mean the 7th stage, consciousness only. The physical world remaining as such. The radical claim is made as this is not a second apart from consciousness. No two, Advaita, non-dual. Advaita literally means non-dual. Appearing to be two, but not two.